to the Peer Review Podcast, Creativity and Fulfillment in Academia. I'm Sarah Bunin-Benor. In each episode, my co-host Mira Sugarov and I speak to fellow scholars and other experts about how to live a good academic life. Today, I'll be interviewing Ilana Horwitz. Ilana M. Horwitz is the Fields Rayant Chair of Contemporary Jewish Life and an assistant professor of Jewish Studies and Sociology at Tulane University. She has a PhD in Sociology of Education and Jewish Studies from Stanford University. Her award-winning first book was Gods, Grades, and Graduation: Religion's Surprising Impact on Academic Success. And I really see Ilana as an entrepreneurial scholar based on her diverse research topics, her success in the job market, how her research is received, her involvement in various programs, and her public engagement. And the Entrepreneurial Scholar is also the title of an important book that she wrote, which we will be talking about today. Welcome to our podcast, Ilana.
Thanks so much for having me, Sarah.
So tell us briefly about your research.
Sure. My research broadly examines how people's religious upbringing, their gender background, their social class, and their racial and ethnic identities influence their lives, particularly their educational outcomes. So I'm trained as a sociologist of education and a sociologist of religion by training, and that very much informs my work. And a lot of my work is based on large-scale surveys, often that are longitudinal, where I follow people over time. And a lot of my research is also based on qualitative interviewing. I really like both the macro and the micro. And I write a lot about American Jews, and I also write about conservative Christians.
Great, great. So that is related to your first book. Are you working on a similar related topic now?
Right now, I'm actually finishing my third book. The manuscript is due in a couple of weeks, and that book is tentatively titled The Unequal Climb. We'll see if that title sticks, but it's really examining how gender shapes educational pathways for mostly working class kids, because there's a big story sort of in the news these days about how women are outperforming men in college graduation and even college admissions. And actually, it's a really complicated story once you look at the role of social class in that story. So that is a book that uses the same data set that I used for my first book, but it doesn't have a strong religion angle. And then I'm also working on a fourth book, which is about economic vulnerability in the American Jewish community, based on data that I collected last year. And that's a topic I'm very passionate about these days. And I'm excited to get that work out in the world.
How many assistant professors can say, I'm working on my fourth book? Impressive.
To be fair, I did have a really great postdoc, which I'm happy to talk about later. And that actually really helped set me up for success as an assistant professor, something many people don't realize, that if you have a good postdoc, it really can make a big difference for you.
That's a really good point. So your bio actually includes something about your public engagement. It says, Dr. Horwitz's work has been published in leading journals, including the American Sociological Review, and she's committed to making her research accessible to broader audiences through outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and The Conversation. How did you first get into that kind of public engagement?
So I actually never intended to be an academic. To be honest, Sarah, and I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, but I'll say it here in the public, on the public record. When I went to college, I thought my professors were like fairly boring and not super relevant. The last thing I would have ever imagined myself doing. I didn't love to read. I wasn't very intellectually curious. I'm an immigrant. I went to college as like a first-gen college student. I mean, my parents had college degrees in Russia, but I was very much interested in the socioeconomic mobility goals that college provides a lot of kids. And I had a whole first career that was not in academia. I worked in the business world. I was a teacher. I did a bunch of different things, and I was really passionate about education. And I kept trying to figure out how to bridge my interest in education and Excel spreadsheets. I really love data. And I kind of ended up in a PhD program a little bit by chance. I know that sounds weird. Like I only applied to one program. I wasn't one of these people that was like, one day I'm going to become an academic and I'm going to get a PhD. I was like, I'm going to get a PhD because I want to start my own business and it would help to have those letters to give my name some credibility. And so I ended up at Stanford in the Education and Jewish Studies program, and with really no intention of becoming an academic. And I realized, like in my first year, that I didn't understand what academia was all about. I had a very different image of what it was. So when I did end up in grad school, and I realized that what I'd been craving for most of my 20s was this desire to have agency and autonomy over my work. And when I realized that that's what academia really affords you, I was like, oh, I want to do this forever. This is amazing. Nobody ever told me about this part. But when I decided that I was going to make a run for an academic position and try the academic job market, I also made a promise to myself, and that was the following: that I wasn't going to be one of those academics whose work just like collected dust on bookshelves. And I wasn't going to write in academic jargon. It was really important to me that what I spent all these years doing actually reached real people. And so once I made that commitment, I also had to figure out like, well, how do I do that? I don't know anything about public scholarship. And I was really lucky. I was able to take a class with Sam Weinberg, who taught a class that I audited actually in my 6th year about how to write for a public audience. And I'd never done that before. And I learned so much. And our final assignment was that we had to write an op-ed that we had to submit. It didn't matter if it got accepted, but we had to submit it. And that op-ed actually is what led to this entire book, The Entrepreneurial Scholar. I am happy to share the journey of that op-ed. I'll just say, like, it got rejected many times. I learned a lot. It took 2 years to publish, and it had a very unexpected result, which was this book that I was commissioned to write by Princeton University Press. And it was something I never expected to do, and it was actually a very entrepreneurial endeavor in many ways. So that's how I got into public scholarship.
So where was that op-ed published?
I ended up publishing it in Inside Higher Ed.
So that's interesting. And yes, you write about that in the book. And also, Mira, my co-host, had a similar experience. She wrote an op-ed and a publisher said, can you write a book based on that? Or actually, it was a book about writing op-eds. And I just remembered that you and I were both students at a workshop that Mira gave about writing op-eds.
Yeah, the public influence one, right?
Yeah. So I knew about your book, The Entrepreneurial Scholar, before it was published because I'm one of the 43 people that you interviewed for the book. So, of course, when I read it, it really, really resonated with me. And one of the things that stood out to me was this idea of the entrepreneurial mindset, also known as effectual thinking, seeing what resources you have and then figuring out what you can make out of them. And I really liked your analogy of cooking, where you talk about having some ingredients and then making something that you don't even know what you're going to make when you start making it, versus having a recipe, going shopping, and then cooking exactly that recipe. And that's totally how I often approach cooking. I mean, I sometimes also follow recipes, but I love cooking and I do that all the time. We get a farm shipment every week, and I just love that challenge of being creative with the produce that you have in your fridge. So tell us how that has played out in your life, that idea of effectual thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually funny, right? The idea in the book, just for people who haven't read it, is that we tend to think, right? You can think of yourself as like you might be having a dinner party. And so you find some recipes and you go to the store and you buy ingredients XYZ. And a lot of people think of their research in that way, like, here's the end result I want to get to, and here's what I need to do. And I posit in the book that entrepreneurial thinking requires us to not actually know what is going to become the result. So it's kind of like you are having a dinner party and basically you look in your fridge or your pantry and you're like, here are the ingredients I have and here's what I'm going to make. So you actually don't, there's a high level of uncertainty there, and you don't know what's going to happen at the end. And I actually find that most of my research pans out that way. I will start a project thinking it's going to end, in one way, and then it totally leads into several other directions. And that has to do with conditions shifting, with data shifting, with collaborations shifting. And there's a kind of like excitement, I think, to sort of not knowing exactly where something is going to lead, and being able to pull together disparate resources that you may not have thought, or like different ingredients that you may not have thought. And that often will lead you down a path that you didn't expect. Um, and it's funny, I don't do good cooking without a recipe. I'm definitely like not entrepreneurial in the kitchen, but I am in my scholarship.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know a lot of people are uncomfortable cooking without a recipe. So you mentioned the idea that sometimes you have to pivot when you have this approach, and I'll add an example to that. Sometimes I have had the experience of I'm planning to work on an article that day, or maybe plan out my class or something, and then I read something in the newspaper, and I find out maybe a politician said something that's relevant to my work, and then I realize, okay, I have to just spend the next 2 days writing this op-ed. And it doesn't matter what I was planning to do because, yeah, I have deadlines, but I'll figure it out. Do you feel like that's a common thing for the people that you interviewed?
Um, I for some people, not everybody that I interviewed was committed to public scholarships. Several people were, but not everybody was. And to be able to do what you're saying, like to be able to read the news and be able to sort of take the time to pivot, requires definitely some skill and the sort of ability to like let some things go, which is very hard, especially for more junior scholars. And I just want to be really like transparent about that is an easier thing to do later in the later stages of our career, especially for people for whom public scholarship doesn't count as much, right, for their tenure. And it takes, the first several op-eds I wrote, it took me so long, so long. So the ability to just be like, oh, I'm going to spend 2 days. I was like, I'm going to spend the next like 2 weeks dealing with this. It's gotten easier over time. So yes, for sure, some people who are entrepreneurial are able to do that. I'll give you an example of how that happened with me. Like I was working, and people think that to write for the public, you have to have like a totally finished product. And I actually want to say that that's not necessarily the case. I was writing this book that I'm working about, Gender in Higher Education, when Roe v. Wade was being overturned, and I realized that the women I was that were in the interview sample, a lot of them had dropped out of college because of unexpected pregnancies, and I was like, oh, we actually have something to say about this. And I had a research assistant, and I was like, let's write an op-ed. And we did. And I think it got published also in Inside Higher Ed. And then as a result of that, we got interviewed by the Chronicle and interviewed by a few other places. So that's also entrepreneurial. Like I didn't know where that was going to lead. Sometimes my op-eds lead to nowhere, and sometimes they lead to lots of different things. And that's really exciting.
Yeah, and you even got an op-ed published in the New York Times. What was that one about?
So that one was based on my first book, which is about how being religious affects kids in America. It's mostly a book about conservative Christians. And Sarah, I'll say that that op-ed took an incredible amount of like creativity to get it placed. It's it's hard to just like write to the New York Times and pitch something and get it accepted. And so I had to think really creatively about how to use my own network. So basically I wrote this op-ed, and I tried going through the regular channels. Then I have a colleague whose husband was writing for the New York Times, so I sent it to him to forward to the right people. That didn't get me anywhere. And a few months earlier, when I was a postdoc at the Stanford Center on Longevity, I was presenting at a conference, and I was interviewed by someone at the New York Times. And we had a lovely conversation for about 45 minutes. And at the end of the conversation, after I was very generous with my time and she was very happy, I said, in a couple of months, I'm going to have a book come out, and I'd love to get something in the New York Times. Like, how do I do that? Who might I be able to contact? Like, I was already thinking ahead of time about that. And she said, when that happens, reach out to me and I'll help you. And so after my other contacts didn't get me anywhere, I reached out to her and I said, hey, remember me? And she forwarded it to the right person, and that person was interested. And, some people think I just like got really lucky. And yes, there's some luck, but you also have to be very creative about who you identify in your network and how you use those contacts and use them strategically and wisely. And that op-ed actually ended up in the print edition of the paper, which is like extra exciting. above the Thomas Friedman article that day, above the fold. So it was definitely one of the highlights of my career at that point. It was really exciting for me, especially because the New York Times isn't a publication that necessarily takes religion seriously. And I was really committed to trying to get the liberal elite to take religion seriously in America. And that's why I wanted that op-ed in that publication.
Yeah, well, I think it was not just exciting for you, it was exciting for me and other people who know you, and like all of us who have been trying to get op-eds in the New York Times. I mean, whenever I have an op-ed that I think is relevant to a broad audience, I'll start by submitting it to the New York Times, and then I'll submit it to the Washington Post a few days later, and then other venues, and then it will end up in the Conversation or in some Jewish publication. And it's on this podcast, we talk a lot about failing and being rejected and how that's a normal part of academia. I think it's also a normal part of the public engagement part of academia.
Absolutely. And by the way, don't poo-poo the conversation. I love the conversation. I think that that has yielded so much for me,
Yeah.
because the conversation, for people who don't know, is an outlet, first of all, without a paywall. Their tagline is academic rigor meets journalistic flair. I think they have a really important mission because they get academics to put their research into like 700 words without any academic jargon. And then they syndicate with the Religion News Service, with the AP. Stuff that I've had in the conversation ended up in the Washington Post. It ended up in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in a big spread. So I've had like lots of success.
I've had similar experiences, and I didn't mean to poo-poo them. They are definitely a great venue for publication, and sometimes I even turn to them first.
Good. But yes, I can, talk for hours about my failures. I have had so many failures. I have shed many, many tears over my failure CV. And I think we should normalize failure. I mean, now it's easier for me to have failures than it was earlier when I didn't know what was going to happen to me.
Yeah, and in your book you talk about failing forward and learning lessons from your failures, and I think that's a really important part of any entrepreneurial work, but also academia in particular.
Yes, absolutely.
So you also talk about opportunities outside of traditional academic jobs. And several of the people that you interviewed have left academia. Some of them actually work in jobs that support academics. Can you tell us about some of those people that you interviewed for your book?
Yes. And I talked to some people who work in higher education administration. And then I interviewed my friend and colleague Tamara, who was working at The Economist. And so there are ways to parlay your academic training into these kinds of, some people call them alt-ec pathways, but they're really amazing pathways that aren't just like a backup plan because you failed, right? A lot of people are like, oh, I failed, so I have to do this. And I'm like, no, you didn't fail. You actually pursued this really great thing. That actually probably allows you to live wherever you want, probably pays you better, and probably maybe has good work life balance. I think it's important for people listening to know I came into academia from a different career, right? I had worked in management consulting. I had tried a bunch of other things, and I've also like hustled for much of my life by piecing together pieces of employment. In college, I had like 3 or 4 random jobs. Not only was I a Sunday school teacher, but I also was a photographer for fraternity parties and corporate events, and had all sorts of odd jobs. And I've had that mentality for most of my life. And even when I was in grad school, I took a consulting job for a Jewish organization that paid me $12 an hour. And this was like in 2014. And they said, like, we're really sorry, we can pay you $12 an hour. And I was like, great, I'll take it. And the reason I wanted to do it is because they needed somebody to analyze survey data. And I was taking a class in statistics, and I realized like I couldn't learn with the pretend data. I really needed like hands-on, messy data to work with. So I took $12 an hour and I actually learned a ton. And I made great connections. And then I started getting other consulting gigs in the Jewish community. You had mentioned in the beginning when you introduced me that I was successful in the job market. It took me 3 cycles, maybe 4 cycles, and I had a ton of failure. And actually, when I graduated from Stanford, Sarah, I didn't have a job. I did not have an academic job lined up. And I came up, sort of in the weeks leading up to graduation when I realized that I did not have a job. I came up with a plan, and that plan was as follows. I found a consulting job working mostly for Jewish organizations that, because consulting pays better than academia, I was like, oh, I could just work 20 hours doing that. And then I will spend my other 20 to 30 hours of the week writing and doing sort of more academic things. And that is essentially what a postdoc would make. And I didn't confer my degree so that I could stay in Stanford housing, and I could continue using Stanford libraries and Stanford letterhead and sort of all those grad school privileges. So I had to be really creative. And part of that was because I had hustled like my entire life to get to that point. And there are people who I talked to who had similar things, who were piecing together opportunities. And it's harder for some people. If you're an international student, it's really hard. There are like visa constraints, and some advisors really do not promote you working outside of your research. And I understand why that is. But I do think it opens up your mind and allows you to see possibilities for yourself outside of academia. And realistically, most people are going to have to pursue those other options, given the nature of the academic job market.
Yeah, totally. Well, that's helpful, I think, to our listeners to hear that it didn't just come easily and it took a lot of hustling. Yeah. So we have been asking our guests about what we see as kind of a continuum or a distinction between the slow professor on the one hand and the clockwork muse on the other hand. And let me explain what I mean. So the clockwork muse is a book about productivity, and books like that call for scheduling your time to be as productive as possible. Whereas there's a book called The Slow Professor, which argues against the emphasis on productivity and that you should have time to cultivate your ideas. So I'm wondering, where do you fall on that continuum, and how does it relate to your idea of the entrepreneurial scholar?
Yeah, that's such an it's a timely question. First of all, I talk about the slow professor in my books. And actually, this is an important time to clarify what I mean by entrepreneurship, because we didn't do that. And I think a lot of people, that word is a turnoff. They hear it, they think I'm talking about trying to make money off of your ideas. And I want to disabuse people of that notion. When I talk about people thinking in entrepreneurial ways, what I mean is the following. It means being able to generate new knowledge with very limited resources while navigating an environment of high uncertainty. That is what entrepreneurs do, and that is what academics do. Many entrepreneurs who we think of did not start out being like, oh, I want to make a ton of money. They saw a problem in the world and they came up with an idea, and there was a ton of uncertainty, and they pieced together a bunch of different social resources, physical resources, monetary resources to make that idea come to fruition. So that is what I mean by entrepreneurship. To your question about sort of where I am on the spectrum of between like people should just kind of take things slow versus this efficiency thing, I probably fall in the middle. I know that academics sometimes work on books for 5 to 10 years, and they will ask for lots of extensions on books. And I don't believe that that's actually a good strategy, because sometimes it takes so long for people to write the most perfect book in the world that they either hate their subject matter by the time they're done with it, or like no one's talking about that topic at all. I do think good ideas take a while. Look, all my projects take a couple of years minimum, and my papers take as long as my books. But I am also very committed to efficiency. I am an obsessive planner. I do appreciate a good Outlook calendar where I schedule my time. But when I write, I tend to binge write, and I need to be in a particular kind of environment. Like I do a lot of writing in the summers where I don't have other things going on, because I know that really good ideas require me to like stand up, walk around, listen to an audiobook, like do something. That's when ideas generate. So I think there's merit, to both perspectives, and I fall in the middle of that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But it sounds like you're kind of more on the productive side then. But with the idea that it's important to have some of that downtime to help the thoughts come.
Yes, I think that's right. I think I'm known as kind of like a doer. And earlier in my career, sometime in my 20s, I took one of these tests that help you figure out where in the life cycle of a project you get your energy. It doesn't mean that you're bad or good at this, but it's where you get your energy. And those cycles, those 4 things, it's like the 4 E's. There is let me see if I can get them: explore, excite, examine, and execute. So explore is like the initial stages of a project, the idea generation. Excite is like the stage where you're like trying to get everybody on board. Examine is this like very detail oriented, like in the weeds stage. And then execute is like actually getting the work done. And I have to say, like, I get a lot of energy in the first, second, and fourth. I don't get a lot of energy in that deep examine stage. I really like big picture thinking, but I also love executing. I am a doer. I make things happen. I get things done and I don't let projects die.
Oh, I also like a part in your book where you talk about minimum viable product, which is a concept I wasn't familiar with. And tell us about that.
Yeah, the MVP. Basically, like in the entrepreneurship world. So my first job, Sarah, out of college, actually it was my second job, but I'd only been out for a couple months. I was applying for the Peace Corps and I was waiting for that application to go through, and I needed something else to do. And my friend's dad and brother had started a company. This is like the early 2000s, pre-iPhone, when people used to collect a lot of paper receipts. And so people would like keep shoe boxes of receipts. And if you were a business traveler, you kept all those paper receipts and then you would give them to, your administrative assistants and you traveled with them. And so my friend's dad and brother started this company called Neat Receipts, which was like a little scanner, and it used optical character recognition, OCR technology, which was very cool in like 2003. So that when you scan your receipt, it extracts the information and populates it into an Excel spreadsheet. And they needed somebody to sell this, and their first point of sale was the Philadelphia airport. Their first product that I was selling was not perfect. Like, it had a lot of bugs, but at some point they realized they were running out of funding. They needed real users in the real world to test their product, and they were going to put out a product that wasn't perfect, and they were going to learn a lot from the calls that that came through to the customer service line, and they were willing to deal with like returns and some angry customers. That is a minimally viable product, an MVP. And I think in research we have something similar. So I think some advisors, and I understand why they do this, they tell their students, their grad students, like, don't put anything out in the world until you're 100% like perfectly sure about what you're going to argue. I tend to take a bit of a different perspective in that I think it's helpful to put small ideas out there to see what kind of feedback you get, to see what kind of reaction you get. There's this great book. It's a children's book. It's called What Do You Do with an Idea? I talk about it in the Entrepreneurial Scholar. And it's basically this kid who kind of has an idea and it's scary. And at first, he doesn't want to talk about it with anybody because he doesn't want to get laughed at or teased. And so he really hides the idea. And over time, this idea kind of grows and he starts to share it. And it sort of it has more color and it has more depth. And this idea grows. And I think like research should be like that. We should be able to put our ideas out in the world. They may not be perfect. You may not be able to argue it 100%, but it helps you talk out loud. It helps you refine your ideas when you're able to talk out loud about them, or to able to like get feedback on them. And the way you do that is by putting out this MVP, this minimally viable product into the world and testing it out.
Yeah, and that resonated with me in interesting ways. So it relates to the idea of perfectionism, right? That is something that is a problem for a lot of academics, that they want to keep refining something until they feel it's perfect, and that can be forever, right? And it's a tension between getting it out and getting it right and getting it perfect, or also a tension between A+ work and A- work, I guess we could say. But I was thinking about the MVP in relation to public engagement, because you talk about that in the book as well. Talk about how you can kind of test out your ideas on public audiences before you publish academic work. And I certainly did that with my idea of ethno-linguistic infusion. I actually have a paper that's about to come out right now in an academic journal. I came up with the idea over 10 years ago, and I haven't yet published an academic article theorizing this concept. I mean, it appears in other work of mine, but why did I wait so long? Well, I guess partly because I had other projects, but also because I wanted to let it simmer, and I think that ended up being beneficial to my analysis, because also since then new academic concepts have come out and I was able to incorporate those. And I've also been able to workshop the idea at not just academic conferences, but also in the applied realm. Like, for example, in my book with my colleagues, Hebrew Infusion, we talk about infusion, and that actually has become a popular applied concept in the field of Jewish education. And so now I know that my idea has applicability. So when I finished my academic article about it, I was able to say that it's not just useful for academic analysis, but it has application.
Mm. Yeah, first of all, congratulations. It's exciting. And yeah, absolutely. I think one of the gifts of being an academic is like you sometimes will come up with an idea, you don't even realize it maybe, and it's okay to let it sit there. I think this is something, going back to the slow professor, that there's sort of a value in letting it simmer. But now you've had the kind of chance to test it out and see how it applies in the real world and across different audiences, which I think is an important part of our job.
Yeah. So in your book, you talk a lot about first generation college students and low income students and people of color. And tell us a little bit about how these underrepresented groups in academia have different experiences than people who are not in those underrepresented groups.
Sure. I think it's fairly well documented, and I'm a sociologist of education, so I know this literature fairly well, that people who end up in PhD programs often are people who've come from families where there are already academics. And so they kind of already know the hidden curriculum and the rules of the game. And what ends up happening is that students who don't have that knowledge, right, show up in grad school, and these are people who tend to be first gen, low income, or BIPOC scholars, who feel like they're at a disadvantage, and in many ways they are. And in my book I try to say, like, actually, yes, you're at a disadvantage in that you don't know the hidden curriculum, but you have actually spent most of your life trying to figure out how to navigate a world of high uncertainty with very limited resources. Like, in a way, you have the advantage of knowing how to do this, and trying to see that as a strength as opposed to a limitation. This book falls in the self-help genre, and I really want to try to empower people who feel like they're disadvantaged to recognize the strength in what they do bring to the table. Because, you talked about perfectionism. And look, the average person who ends up in a PhD program is somebody who's like been so good at school that they're like, I want to go pro, right? They have figured out how to master the hidden curriculum, how to get A's on everything. They've been stellar students. And then they get to grad school, and oftentimes those stellar students actually aren't the ones who thrive because they're so used to being told what to do and kind of like regurgitating things and being the perfect student. And I don't think the best PhDs are necessarily the most perfect students, because you need to shift from being a really good consumer of information to being a really good producer of knowledge. And that mindset requires a shift in how you approach your work. Because everything that you read is in purpose of trying to solve a puzzle. But you need to be able to take agency and, like, not just wait for your advisor to tell you what to do. You have to kind of like make your own rules and chart your own territory to be able to do that. And so I think realizing that perfectionism isn't necessarily what gets everybody to success, I think can be liberating, for people like me who were maybe not the most perfect students, but still managed to do well in the PhD.
Yeah, I think that part of your book is empowering, and I hope you've gotten positive feedback on it from multiple groups.
Yes, I have. Thank you. I hope it is empowering to your listeners and to people who read it.
Great, great. Your book really focuses on research and public engagement, and I was wondering how the ideas in the book might also apply to teaching.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I thought a lot about whether teaching was going to go into the book, and eventually it did not make it into the book. I think with teaching, in thinking about how do you pull together resources while, navigating some uncertainty, I teach a lot of classes. I'm a person who studies contemporary American Jewish life. And so my classes are constantly changing. My stuff, my syllabus changes so much from year to year. And so I've been trying to, in like this spirit of thinking entrepreneurially, leverage the resources in my community. So I live in New Orleans. I'm not from New Orleans. I've lived here for a couple of years. And so this semester, or last year, as I was thinking about what I wanted to teach this semester, I have selfishly like really wanted to understand how Hurricane Katrina, which is now in its 20th year anniversary next week, impacted the Jewish community. Because I keep hearing about like people saying, "Oh my gosh, our the day school, almost closed during Katrina, and it's finally back to its original numbers," or the synagogue, lost 60% of its members, or stuff like that. And I'm like, I really want to figure that out. So I was like, oh, I should teach a class on this topic so that I could learn about this and maybe write an article. And I realized there are so many experts in the New Orleans community who are happy to come and like speak in my class. Most of them will come and do it for free. And so I've been really like leveraging those resources and connections to teach new classes and learn about things that I wouldn't necessarily have a chance to teach myself otherwise.
Oh, that's a great example of entrepreneurial orientation in teaching. I love that. And really thinking about your teaching as a way to help you with your research and vice versa. But also thinking about the students' experiences in the classroom as service learning, like that they can do a service to the world, and that is part of their learning.
Yeah, I actually teach a Jewish leadership class that has a direct service learning component. But in this class, this Katrina class, what I actually learned in doing research for the class is that there's an archive through the Jewish Women's Archive of 85 interviews that were collected in 2007 after the hurricane. And no one has ever written about these interviews. They're just sitting there. And I was like, oh, what a great opportunity for my students to analyze data and for me to potentially generate ideas from that to write an article. Maybe think like something about the role of social capital. I have no idea what themes will emerge, but I wouldn't have known about that archive without this. And for
Wow.
my students, it's going to be a great hands-on experience to play with real data and analyze those transcripts.
Wow, that's great. So you mentioned before that you do a lot of your writing in the summers, which I know most of us do. Tell us what the perfect workday would look like for you in the summer.
Oh my gosh, I love this question, Sarah. Okay, well, we leave New Orleans for the summer and I basically get to design our summers in a way that's really productive for my writing. My perfect day is basically I tend to wake up really early. I'll wake up at like 5:30. I have two young kids. I guess they're not that young anymore. They're 12 and 9, but they luckily sleep late. So this summer we were in Tahoe for a family vacation. But I woke up at 5:30 and I sit there with a cup of coffee with a really beautiful view. And I write basically for like 4 to 5 hours while everyone is my family's kind of slow to move, which is great for me. And then we go on a hike, we do an activity, and then my kids need downtime. So we come back, I work a little bit more, and then we do an evening activity. That is really perfect for me because it has all the elements that I love. And then later in the summer, we stayed in some places with kayaks and with nice sort of walking trails. It's important to me to be in a place where I have the chance to walk around and listen to audiobooks. I really love audiobooks when I'm writing because there's something about listening to an author as opposed to reading an author that stimulates sort of like rhetoric in my mind that I wouldn't have thought of. So I take a lot of breaks to kayak or to walk around and listen to audiobooks. And I'm an obsessive, I drink solidly 2 cups of coffee a day, usually at 5:30 or 6 a.m. and again at noon. And that's how I make it through.
So when you listen to your audiobooks, do you find yourself pausing to just kind of think about ideas as they come to you?
Yes, I use Audible and then like I'll stop and I'll jot down notes in the Audible the bookmark thing. I'll say something like, "Oh, this connects to my idea of such and such," and then I'll come back to all of those notes later.
Hmm.
Also, when I write, I don't meticulously cite as I go. I word vomit,
Mhm.
and my work is messy and it gets moved around a lot. But it's really like later on that I go through and do a lot of citations because I find that if I do, I'm not super methodical, because that bogs me down. So my goal is just to get words on paper, and I don't outline before I write. I have no idea, honestly, what I'm going to say. I sit down with an empty page and I see what comes out.
Mm.
Um,
Well, that sounds entrepreneurial.
Not everyone's cup of tea, but works for me.
Totally. Totally. Okay, so that's during the summer. What about during the school year? Do you feel like you can get some writing done then too?
To be honest, like in my first year at Tulane, I got no writing done. It was so hard. So for any early career faculty, just know that those first year or two where you're like designing your classes and really figuring out how things work, it's just not a productive writing time. And then actually I did the faculty success program. I can't remember who runs it. But during that process, we spent like a week just kind of diagramming or keeping track of where we spent our time and color coding it based on what we get rewarded for by our university and what we actually spend time on. And I realized that I was spending time on tasks that I have no incentive to do, and I wasn't spending enough time on my writing. And so that helped me realize maybe have 2 days of my week where I only schedule things that have to do with students or sort of busy work, and that I really devote certain days to writing. The waking up early really helps me. And also here's a tip I tell people in the book, and I learned this from somebody else. The motivation to write does not come from these technical fixes, right? You can use all the Pomodoro timers in the world and you can wake up at 5:30 and all that. But really, like, the motivation to write comes from feeling like you have something important to say. And if you don't have something important to say, you will never really like come up with all the technical fixes to get those words on paper. You have to really fundamentally believe that what you say matters. And I think a lot of academics don't feel that way. They're like, no one's ever going to read this. Well, if you feel like no one's ever going to read it, like, why are you working on it? That's a really hard way to make it through a project. So if you don't feel passionately about what you do, and if you don't think it matters, find something else to write about.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're almost out of time, but I want to give you the chance to say what's one thing you wish you had known when you started grad school.
I wish I had understood, like, I thought grad school was like you have to just read a lot and consume and consume and consume. And I didn't understand how much of it, again, was this like production of knowledge. Luckily, in our orientation, I think it was Eamon Callan, who's a philosopher of education, was the one who said, right, your job is no longer to consume information, it is produce knowledge. And that like really that pivoted my brain in such a productive way. So I was really grateful to get that lesson early on in life. And because I'd always been a good writer, I actually didn't realize how much of grad school, I mean, this is so naive of me to now say in retrospect, like, I didn't realize that my writing skills would be a strength. I didn't realize how much writing mattered. I just thought it was going to be a lot of reading. And I was like, I'm going to be so bad at this. I'm a slow, bad reader. So I wish I had understood sort of what the game was about. I also wish I understood how common failure is. And it really helped me. I have had some really great mentors who were much older, like Lee Shulman is one of my greatest mentors. And he sat with me for many, 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 many hours and told me about his failures. He had a lot of failures. And I only knew him as like this super successful guy who was really famous. And it helped sort of humanize the experience when I learned about all these people's setbacks. And when I saw, professors of mine, I saw their article rejection letters and kind of like their failure CVs. I wish it was more normalized for me how prevalent failure was, because I felt like such a failure for so long, and I had such incredibly deep imposter syndrome. I was because I had a lot of setbacks in my 20s in my career, and I came into grad school with all that, and then I just like had more failure, because when you get to grad school, you realize like you're really not that smart because there's all these people who are so much smarter than you. So it took me a while to realize that even the most accomplished academics have had a ton of failures, and that is really a part of the process.
And that imposter syndrome is the norm.
Yeah, absolutely. It is absolutely the norm. And everyone experiences it. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for talking to us, sharing your wisdom in your book and in this podcast. We really appreciate all that you do, Ilana.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This was really fun to get to chat with you. And thanks for participating in the book project. And it was really fun to get to feature you in the book.
My pleasure. The Peer Review podcast is produced and hosted by Sarah Bunin-Benor and Mira Sukharov. Talia Ehrenberg is assistant producer and editor. The music is written and performed by the Galactic Ambassadors. Support for this podcast comes from a faculty grant from Hebrew Union College. If you would like to sponsor an episode, you can reach us at peerreview@huc.edu. You can join the conversation on Facebook at Peer Review, Cultivating Creativity and Fulfillment in Academia. Thank you for listening.